What's up, nerds? It's your boy, the OGGM. It's 10 o'clock, 10:30 in the morning. It's the 6th day of October 2022. It's about 65 degrees and gloomy here at Site B, and today I want to try and talk about Dungeons & Dragons Cannon. Yet again. I don't know why, but it's still a thing. Mostly because of Jeremy Crawford's latest round of 2014 Dungeons & Dragons, the 2014 Players Handbook. I'm Jeremy Crawford, and I look strangely alien and creepy. And I completely ruined Acquisitions Incorporated. I want you all to be... Okay, so there's what Crawford said, and there's what Perkins said, and there's what everybody said, and then there's what Crawford said again, and there's what I think Crawford means. And this, when we all started this whole stuff, one of the very first things I said was somewhere the choices Wizards of the Coast make sense. Somewhere in a little teeny room in some small corner of the multiverse where the original ideas are hatched, these ideas make sense. But somehow, when they transport from wherever the original ideas were hatched to when we see them, they seem to pass through a layer of stupidity so that by the time we read them or hear them, anybody with a logical brain is going, what the fuck? And one of those is the whole canon nonsense. Somewhere in the infinite timelines, this makes sense. But between the time it was actually put on paper and the time we heard it from Crawford's mouth a couple days ago, it passed through a layer of stupid. So here's what I think Crawford meant in regards to canon. And we're going to use this. All right, so let's just find something. I don't know. First random thing I see. This is a dragon. Well, the skull of a dragon. This is a dragon. Dragons exist. Dragons exist in Dungeons & Dragons. Says so right on the cover. Dungeons & Dragons. The existence of dragons in Dungeons & Dragons is canon to Dungeons & Dragons. Let's see. What's something else? All right. This is a wizard. Wizards exist in fantasy fiction. Wizards exist in Dungeons & Dragons. It's in the Player's Handbook. Wizards are canon to Dungeons & Dragons, 2014 on. Okay? These are monsters attacking a player character in a scene from an adventure. Monsters exist. Player characters exist, and adventures exist. Let's say this adventure is Storm King's Thunder. Storm King's Thunder exists in Dungeons & Dragons. Storm King's Thunder is canon to the Dungeons & Dragons Sacred timeline. If you go through the list of adventures from 2014 on, the adventures that Wizards of the Coast have published are canon in that they are Dungeons & Dragons adventures that took place in a certain time point in the Forgotten Realms / canon Dungeons & Dragons world. And there's even a timeline you can find for when these events happened in relations to the Forgotten Realms. And that timeline is canon to Dungeons & Dragons. So what Crawford is meaning is these things exist. These things are empirical truths to Dungeons & Dragons as we produce it. Dragons exist in Dungeons & Dragons. That's canon. Storm King's Thunder is an adventure we wrote. That's canon. The events of Storm King's Thunder happened in the sacred timeline of Wizards of the Coast adventures, which means there are a series of events that happened before Storm King's Thunder. There was Storm King's Thunder, and then there were the series of events that happened after Storm King's Thunder that led up to Tomb of Annihilation. Tomb of Annihilation happened. There was a series of events that happened after Tomb of Annihilation that led up to Rime of the Frost Maiden and the final reveal of what those black obelisks meant and how they connected to Vecna. Sadly, for whatever reason, Wizards of the Coast didn't pull the plug on that, but that was canon going up to Rime of the Frost Maiden. So everything that happened from the very first D&D adventures, Mines of Fendelhaven, all the way up to Rime of the Frost Maiden were canon in the sacred timeline of Dungeons & Dragons as produced by Wizards of the Coast. Everything that happened after Rime of the Frost Maiden, well, they haven't really done a major adventure after Rime of the Frost Maiden. Strixhaven, not an adventure. Witchlight, sort of an adventure, but not really, because it takes place someplace else. Ravenloft, well, it's an adventure, but it doesn't take place in the sacred timeline of Dungeons & Dragons. Radiant Citadel, well, that's a location where a series of events happen to happen that have no real connection to the sacred timeline of Dungeons & Dragons, the canon timeline. And Spelljammer, well, that happens, and there are events that happened in the sacred timeline of Dungeons & Dragons after Tomb of Annihilation that led to certain individuals like Mert the Moneylender being now in Spelljammer at the Spelljammer Academy. How did that individual get to the Spelljammer Academy? They'll explain it eventually, but that's canon. So, Mind Flayers are canon to Dungeons & Dragons. Beholders are canon to Dungeons & Dragons. Doppelgangers are canon to Dungeons & Dragons. The presentation of those individuals, the way they are presented, is canon to Dungeons & Dragons. But the word Mind Flayer is not, because we've seen it used in other locations, like Stranger Things. But the Mind Flayer in Stranger Things did not look like the Mind Flayer from Dungeons & Dragons, because that imagery is unique to Dungeons & Dragons and canon to Dungeons & Dragons. But the word, not so much. Like, beholder, that word isn't theirs. But the image of the beholder is theirs. That image and those words connected are canon to D&D. But that image can appear in other forms that aren't Dungeons & Dragons. You just have to change the name. I mean, how many eye tyrants have we seen? So what Crawford meant was a series of events happened in a certain order that's canon. And certain things like goblins and dragons and wizards and player characters exist in Dungeons & Dragons. Everything we've made from 2014 on is canon to Wizards of the Coast, Dungeons & Dragons Sacred Timeline, and canon to Wizards of the Coast sacred IP of certain individuals, creatures, and images that exist. That's what Crawford is saying. Now, if you, for some reason, want to run a D&D campaign where there are no dragons, you can do that. You can do that. If you want to run a D&D campaign where Storm King's Thunder never happened because you're not running it on the Forgotten Realms, or you don't own that adventure, you can do that. That's perfectly up to you. If you want to run an adventure from the old days that Wizards of the Coast hasn't upgraded to 5e, like, I don't know, Keep on the Borderlands, Palace of the Vampire Princess, parts of Descent to the Depths of the Earth. You know, there's tons of TSR stuff, there's tons of 3.5 stuff, and there's tons of 4 stuff that haven't been upscaled to 5e. So in the Sacred Wizards of the Coast post-2014 timeline, Palace of the Silver Princess is not canon because it has not been converted to a 5e adventure by Wizards of the Coast. Keep on the Borderlands is not canon because it has not been converted to a 5e adventure by Wizards of the Coast. But a 5e version of Keep on the Borderlands is out there. It's just not canon because another company did it. Hopefully that clarifies or more confuses what Crawford tried to mean. We know what Crawford said, and we know what we heard, and a lot of us got upset over what we heard, and the rest of us are just like, look, it's nothing he hasn't said before, and he's going to change his mind in 20 minutes anyway, so why are you upset? But what Crawford meant, again, was goblins, bugbears, player characters, dragons, mind flayers, long swords, fireball spells, Bigby are canon to 2014 forward Dungeons and Dragons because we produced it and we made it in 5e. There are 5e goblins that Wizards of the Coast made, so those goblins are canon. There are 5e adventures that Wizards of the Coast made, so those adventures are canon to the sacred timeline of Dungeons and Dragons that Wizards of the Coast has created since 2014 till today. Mert the Moneylender being in Spelljammer is canon. That doesn't mean you have to have Mert the Moneylender in your D&D campaign because D&D is part of a multiverse. An infinite number of timelines exist. So, to steal some terminology from the MCU, as I have, there is the sacred Wizards of the Coast timeline, and then there are the infinite other timelines, one of which is your game. So, in your game, if there's no goblins, that's fine. If you're running a world that isn't the Forgotten Realms, that's fine. If you're running a world that has the fighter character class, well, that fighter character class is canon to Dungeons and Dragons as produced by Wizards of the Coast since 2014. That's what he meant. Well, okay, that's it. That's all I got. Hopefully I have clarified this nonsense or made it worse. Either way, you let me know. If you have any questions, if you think I'm wrong, if you want to chime in on this ridiculousness, if you think Crawford needs to be replaced with a clone, or he already has been replaced from a clone, or whatever else you think about the OneD&D Cannon Dungeons and Dragons nonsense, let me know. And as long as you're here, why don't you consider supporting me by buying my merch? Buy my merch. Remember, I will sell out. Talk to you later. Happy holidays.